Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our webinar on lessons learned during 8 real-world aerial inspection scenarios. Before we begin, please be sure to mute yourself just to eliminate any background noise. Also, if you think of any questions during the webinar, please feel free to submit them in the chat section on your screen, and we will answer as many questions as we can during the Q&A session. So today's speakers are Christina Martinez and Colin Romberger. Christina is a Dart Drones flight instructor, commercial pilot, and CFII with a commercial aviation and air traffic control degree from the University of North Dakota. She has over 1,000 hours of flight time and owns a small drone business which focuses on aerial inspections and photography. Colin graduated from Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University as one of the first 5 students to earn a master's degree in unmanned aircraft systems with a focus in flight operations and systems design. He holds multiple FAA airman certificates for manned aircraft operations and also runs a drone services company focusing on aerial mapping and inspections. Colin is also the chief pilot and operations consultant at Dart Drones. So many of you already know that the use of drones for inspections is continuously growing across various industries. A few of these being commercial and residential real estate, construction, engineering, agriculture, oil and gas, telecom, and insurance. Drones truly are transforming the way professionals complete projects and daily operations. And that's what we really want to show you all today, how drones are being used for so many different scenarios and the lessons learned from each of those. So we have a lot of great aerial inspection scenarios to cover in today's webinar. So I will actually pass it right over to Colin and we will jump into it.
Okay, thanks a lot, Alicia. Appreciate it. Just test the sound and make sure you guys can hear me just fine.
Yes, thanks.
All right, perfect. Thank you very much. So yeah, I appreciate everyone jumping on, and Christina and I hope that we can share some of our experiences with you in some different areas, different projects that we've been involved with, and really help avoid you having to go through some of the same learning curves and fall into some of the same pitfalls that we had to discover. With this industry, being as new as it is, a lot of folks that are out there starting to integrate these aircraft, we are kind of pioneers in a lot of ways. And Christina and I have both been doing this since back in the days before Part 107, when we were operating under Section 333 exemptions. So we've had some time to see some things, learn some things, and hopefully we can pass some of that on to you guys today. So this first project that we were involved with was fairly interesting. I have thankfully only ever been involved with one of these because it was a tragic situation. The photo that you can see on the slide, this is one image that was captured while we were conducting a wide area damage assessment of a subdevelopment neighborhood following a gas explosion at a home. And there, where all of that rubble is sort of centrally located, there used to be a home there in this case. And thankfully, the people that lived there had gotten out before the home actually exploded. But this caused quite a bit of damage, not only obviously to the home that is no longer there, but also to neighboring residences. So one of the things that was necessary when the gas company came in and they were doing their investigation was to figure out, just how many houses had been affected by this, and to be able to, track the scale of debris going through the area. So we actually ended up mapping the entire community, which had been evacuated. So from a standpoint of flight over people and things like that, it was a little bit easier to coordinate than it would be otherwise in this type of environment. But just over 400 acres, and had to involved a lot of work with visual observers, moving folks around so that as our aircraft covered our territory and were capturing all the images that we needed to build a map of this area so that we could do some distance measurements and figure out where this debris spread went. It was took some logistics to do that. So we learned actually quite a bit during this flight. Working in this type of area, but also a couple other things that came up that I wanted to share. One of the first things we learned was always be vigilant when you're using using your autonomous software. A lot of the software that's out there right now for autonomous flight planning, especially the software that's developed for photogrammetry, constructing orthomosaics, things like that, it is developed by third-party developers. So they develop the photogrammetry software to process the images, but the actual command and control software that's working with the aircraft, is theirs as well, and was not necessarily developed by the manufacturer of the aircraft. One of the things that caught up to us on this one for the first time and changed the way we did things in the future was that as we were flying our flights, the software that we were using could determine when our battery was low enough that the aircraft needed to come back so we could swap batteries, and then it would fly back and picked up where it left off. However, it didn't actually do that return process until it got down to what the aircraft system determined was the smart return to home point, the point where it only had enough battery power left basically to get back to our home location. And the problem with that is we were actually flying into the wind a little bit as the aircraft was coming back, and the wind wasn't excessively strong, but it was strong enough. And actually the aircraft was not able to make it all the way back to our home point location before it had to land. Luckily, where it did come down was still fairly close, and the area was open. We were able to secure it, go over there and swap those batteries out. But it did cost us time, and it was something that in the future, when we went forward, we actually started planning our flight paths out so that the aircraft was always basically upwind of our takeoff landing locations. That way, whenever you do have that autonomous return, it doesn't have to, you don't have to worry about fighting the wind. The other thing that we recognized here was, anytime you've got a situation where you may attract the attention of manned aircraft, be aware of that. This obviously, there was a lot of media attention around this situation, and we coordinated with the gas company. We had every right to be there. We were following all the regulations, but we did still have occasion where we had a couple helicopters that one that was from the local news outlet, one that was just we figure on a bit of a sightseeing trip. And helicopters, they can fly low, and they often fly low. When you look at the Federal Aviation regulations, in a lot of situations, manned aircraft will be staying 500 feet above the ground or more. But in actuality, when you're in uncontrolled airspace, they can basically be as low as they need in a situation that they can still execute a safe landing. That's pretty much what the regulations say. So helicopters, they like to check things out. What we ended up doing in this situation was we made a phone call to the air traffic control tower at a nearby airport, because we were just outside of their controlled airspace, and they were able to radio to the aircraft that were in the area and let them know what was going on, so we didn't have to keep interrupting our flight or pausing our autonomous flight as to avoid any conflicts with them. So next scenario there, if you don't mind, Alicia, we'll move on, because I know Christina's got a lot to talk about as well. Some of the other work that we do involves bridge inspections, and unfortunately I don't have any inspection photos to show you from this one where we're looking at any sort of elements, mainly because with our company, we have contracts in place with our clients, and our clients are basically long-term clients. We don't do a whole lot of one-off projects per se, and basically they have the rights to all of our imagery once we capture them. So this is one that just shows you an overview of an area where we did a little bit of bridge inspection work for a railroad company. These were rail tracks that are used by railway, and we went in and did some investigation of critical components around some of those pylons, and also just some areas with the steel structures involved in those tracks. Some of the things that we learned with this in just doing this bridge work, and we do this not only for the railway bridges but also roadway bridges, which we'll see in one of our other scenarios. But whenever you're operating in these environments, and something that I know Christina's had experience with as well, you always have to be aware, that especially if you're going to be underneath those bridges, that your GPS signals are going to be very weak or or unavailable altogether. We've actually gotten into the habit when we are doing inspections that involve work underneath the bridges themselves, if we're looking at different components from that perspective, we will not fly with the GPS enabled. In some situations, I know some users are using a real-time kinematic or an RTK system where the aircraft can get its positioning information from a base station so that it can still have the benefit of that enhanced positioning. Other systems are being developed with proximity sensors so that they can detect how close the aircraft is to the different facades and things or the different structures themselves, and use that to kind of triangulate their position and stay where they need to be. Both of which are great solutions for this, but really, if you don't have those scenarios, you really don't want to, in my experience anyway, leave the GPS system on whenever you're in those types of environments if you know that the potential for low signal or loss of signal is going to be there. Because what can sometimes happen is as that signal starts to degrade, the aircraft can start doing some erratic stuff before the flight computer itself will finally say, okay, I'm going to kick out of here and switch you over just to the manual flight mode in the attitude mode or whatever it is. So that's something to definitely be aware of, and I highly recommend not doing that work unless you're using a system that will give you some other type of enhanced stability using some other types of sensors or that RTK system. Other things you have to watch out for, interference issues, depending on what type of infrastructure is running through that bridge as well. You may have issues with electromagnetic fields. You may have issues with things that can cause an impact on the aircraft stability in other ways as well. I will talk more about electromagnetic fields in one of our other examples, but just know that those things are also present. Whenever you're doing the work underneath the structures, again, overhead environments. A lot of times we don't, when we're flying in open air, we don't think about the effects of those overhead structures and things. And by default, a lot of our systems are set up so that if we do have issues, the automatic default is going to be a return to home type of scenario. Anytime you're doing work like this, where you have these overhead obstructions, you've got to put it in your checklist, and you have to remember to change that because if you are if for whatever reason connected to a GPS satellite positioning signal is still, and you have that data link loss, if the aircraft tries to go up and you don't have any sensors up there to prevent it, then that's going to be a big challenge. Also, lighting conditions. When we're flying under these structures or we're flying around the structures, trying to get proper angles to be able to properly capture and visualize different critical components, shadows, changing effects of cloud cover moving in the area throughout the day, that plays a big role in the quality of the data that we're collecting. And if the images that we're capturing can't clearly show the detail, then we're going to be out of luck. So another lesson learned in doing some of that work over time. Road assessments. So right now, this is probably the majority of the work that my company does is roadway assessments, and we do these for a variety of purposes. New construction development, widening projects, traffic pattern modifications, interchange modifications, things like that. We actually have been doing a lot of work with pothole identification here recently, and depending on the need of the client that we're working with on these, they can vary in terms of what type of images we're capturing and what type of flight paths we need to fly to get all of our different coverage areas. So some of our lessons learned, depending on the nature of the project, one, we always have to be able to really put the time in pre-flight planning whenever we do this type of work. We know that our Part 107 regulations tell us that we cannot fly over moving vehicles on a roadway, and this is not something that we have an exemption for. at this point. We do this work and we still abide by those regulations. So especially if we're trying to do some sort of an orthomosaic assessment or an orthomosaic project where we're collecting images and then using photogrammetry software to again build maps and things that the clients can use for planning purposes and things like that. We have to be very careful how we plan out our flight legs and make sure that we're flying, down medians, we're flying up, center dividers and off on the shoulders. We are not actually ever flying over the moving vehicles. And when it comes time to cross those lanes of traffic, we can't let the autonomous software just do this for us. We have to, pause that and then take manual control often when we do those crossing runs so that we can use the camera system, look for a gap in the traffic and still be able to get where we need to be. So having that extra challenge of, cars on the roadway, workers in certain areas that may not be involved with our project and still being able to, figure out how you're going to maneuver that aircraft to get all of the shots that you need, that's something that you need to determine before the aircraft ever goes in the sky. And you really need to take the time to develop those flight profiles before you start the operation. Also, the using visual observers to extend our operating range. Very important here. If we were to stick just with our line of sight requirements as a single operator, at most, I would say, my eyes, I'm 36 years old. My eyesight's pretty good, but I would say I'm not going to be able to see, more than probably about a half mile or so, given the size of most of our systems in either direction. So if we were only doing, 1 mile at a time, and some of our projects, are 10, 20 miles that they want us to potentially cover in a day, that wouldn't work out very well. So we've developed a system of being able to use visual observers to basically, chain together and keep communication using radios back to myself or one of our other pilots so that we can cover larger stretches at a time. Typically, maybe about 3 miles or so at a time as opposed to just a single mile. So, all things that we've learned as part of that. One of the other things that we learned when we're using visual observers to extend range is, also make sure that they're familiar with, how to watch out the dangers involved with certain birds. Birds of prey, especially during certain times of year, your hawks, eagles, things like that. If they have young in their nests and you're flying around those nesting areas, they can be aggressive. And they don't want you there. And those are situations where you can have a bird attack. So we also, in our pre-flight assessments, whenever we learn about these locations, one of the things we try and do is determine if there would be nesting areas along these stretches of highway that we need to cover. That way, whenever we identify those are usually the areas where I myself will stand so that I can have a better view of whether or not those birds are taking an interest. Because when the aircraft's out of my visual line of sight and it's only another visual observer that's watching it, very hard to avoid that type of situation. Next scenario or last scenario I believe I've got. Utilities infrastructure. This is something that we didn't do a lot of. We were involved with this for about a 3-month period, maybe about a year or so ago. And we were actually working with a client who was starting up their own unmanned aircraft division. And they did power line inspections for a large power company in Pennsylvania. And one of the things that they wanted us to help them with was basically a proof of concept of using an unmanned aircraft system to do some of the work that they were tasked with doing. Some of the things that one of the biggest things that they were asked to do was basically get photographic images to show condition of insulators and also what they call retaining keys that basically are kind of like almost act like cotter pins that kind of hold these lines to their insulators and different attachment points on the structures. So the problem is that when they put these keys in, sometimes they don't put them in the right direction, and when the winds and things kick up, they can easily fall free, and that creates a situation where you could, end up with a structural, problem down the line. So, one of the biggest things that we had to learn with this, and Alicia, you can go ahead and move over to the next slide on this one. One, the importance of establishing a repetitive flight profile. So, when we were looking at not so much the insulators, they're fairly easily accessible, fairly easily viewed when we put the aircraft up. But as far as those little keys go, depending based on their size and kind of where they're mounted, which side of the structures they're mounted on, they can be difficult to get a good image of, even when we're flying an unmanned aircraft, fairly close up. So, being able to, have a test location, if you will, or spend the time to, go to that location and, figure out how you need to maneuver the aircraft around each structure to be able to just go right to the locations where you need those images captured and then sort of move on from there. That's going to save you a lot of time when you get in the field. You really don't want to figure that out the first time you go out on some sort of operational flight because it's really going to make things complicated. It's going to put more workload on your end, and just ultimately be somewhat of a problem. So make sure that you can figure that out ahead of time, and that way it becomes basically a systematic approach as you go from one structure to another. Also, especially with transmission power lines, these types of structures we were working around, and also depending on sort of the structures that they use for these lines as well. The presence of extremely low frequency or ELF electromagnetic fields is very, very strong. And there's different people out there that will tell you, well, if you use this type of aircraft, it's not going to affect you, things like that, or this manufacturer, their aircraft won't be affected. They haven't, seen issues. And I don't doubt that, folks haven't seen issues. But I can tell you from firsthand experience that if you put yourself in the wrong position around those structures, and sometimes you need to go in those positions to get the shots of the components that you've been assigned to do, your magnetometer on that aircraft will be affected if you are not, if that is involved in your position and navigation configuration. So what we found is when we were doing this work, we would not do it unless we had an RTK ground station set up with the aircraft, because even with a model that was an enterprise level aircraft, triple redundant compass modules, GPS receivers, and IMUs, it was still impacted if you left it in the wrong area for more than about a minute or so. All three of those magnetometers were affected and dropped offline. So if you're going to do this type of work, recognize that is something that you have to be aware of. And when that starts going wrong, when that magnetometer starts being affected, you're in for a wild ride. And it's basically like trying to fight a swordfish on the line to get that aircraft to a safe area where the interference is no longer a factor and you can recover it. Also, kind of leading from that, when you are doing this type of work in these more hazardous type of flight environments, having a payload that will allow for optical zoom, with a good optical camera or an optical zoom camera, I should say, really very valuable because it does allow us to enhance our standoff distances, but still be able to get up close and get very detailed photos of our areas of interest without just simply enlarging the pixels that we would do with a digital zoom type of configuration. So if you are doing that type of work, having that optical zoom capability is really going to come in handy. So I think that pretty much does it for me. So I'll go ahead and we'll pass it back to Alicia and Christina.
Great, thanks, Colin. And Christina, we will pass it over to you.
Excellent. So I've got a couple other inspection scenarios I'd like to talk about. And the first is home inspections. So I started my drone company in the real estate industry because that's what I knew and that's where my contacts were. And that kind of led into home inspections. So every time a house or a townhome or a condo or anything is sold, there are often home inspections that go along with it. Because that's part of the purchase process, you typically only have a couple of days to get that home inspected and the client to either accept or reject the offer. So they usually have a short turnaround time. So we might get 12 to 36 hours at the most, usually 24 hours for us to get these jobs done. So the quick jobs, they can come really frequently in the summer, which is awesome, and we can fit them in throughout the day. It's nice because it doesn't matter what time of day it is, whether it's sunny or cloudy, we're just getting good pictures of the roofing. So here's an example of a home that obviously has some damage to it. This is actually, unfortunately, it was new construction, and a windstorm came through, and there was a bunch of houses in the neighborhood that had roofing damage to them. So we're usually hired by the home inspector because they can't reach some part of the roof. Maybe there's low-hanging trees, maybe there's roofing materials that they can't walk on, let's say like solar panels, clay tiles, things like that. Or perhaps the height of the building. A lot of inspectors don't like to go above 2 stories, which is not surprising because that's a long way down if something was to happen. Or in a lot of multiple unit townhomes, things like that, there is no access to the roof. So we get called out for those ones. So let's talk about the types of images that we need to capture for the home inspector. We always do just an overhead shot that shows the entire area. In the top left there, notice that's a little Mavic shadow. We love to fly the Mavic, even the Mavic Air, for our roof inspections. I'll talk about why in just a minute. On the top right, that's an example of clay tiles. The type of roofing will depend on the area that you live in. So I'm in the upper Midwest, so we might see shakes, we will see asphalt shingles, we see some clay tiles, we see a few solar panels here and there, but not maybe as much as down south. So you'll want to see, that will kind of determine what types of roofs you're inspecting. The one on the bottom left, you'll see there's a cracked shingle or a missing asphalt shingle there on the kind of the bottom left of that picture. You're looking for things like that. So anything that sticks out, we get extra pictures. You can't tell in this picture, but I'm actually underneath low-hanging trees where an inspector would not have been able to walk. So this was a 2-story townhome that I was on top of. And then on the bottom right, that picture is also a townhome or a duplex. And not only do we inspect the roofs, but all sides of the house as well. So this one has an overhang. You can see a gutter just to the right of that window. And then there's a lot of detail around those windows, those pop-out windows that we'll be inspecting as well. So the types of inspection and the imagery that you capture is really going to depend on the layout of the home, the area that you live in, and what the inspector can and can't reach. So we always do edge detail shots. We always do an overhead shot. We'll take pictures of any vents or fans or gutters that are there. Just anything that we think that inspector might want to see. The more images, we don't want to overwhelm them with too much, but we want to make sure we capture everything. One thing that we do that I think is key for our company is we always include what I call the beauty shot or the real estate shot. And what that is just that nice framed picture of the front of the home that the home inspector can use for the front of their inspection booklet. And they absolutely love that. It's that extra little piece of service that we can add on that doesn't cost us anything, just an extra minute or two in the air, and the home inspector really appreciates it. So on the next slide, let's talk about some lessons learned. So it's really important to understand exposure control. So we'll do these anywhere from 7 in the morning as soon as the sun comes up to late in the afternoon. Our real estate clients, we like to keep around the noon hour to eliminate those shadows. So we'll do these kind of in the beginning and end of each day. So understanding the exposure control is important because you get a lot of shadows on either end of the days. So we really like to make sure that we are exposing correctly so that we can actually see the detail in the shingles, see the detail in the gutters, and make sure we can identify any damage. We are flying extremely close to the houses. So we're maybe 5 feet away oftentimes, and we're underneath the tree cover. We're flying up next to chimneys. So high wind situations can be a little bit nerve-wracking. And that's one reason that we love to use smaller drones for our residential inspections. Because we're so close to the homes, it's easier to fit the drone into different locations, maybe in the peaks and valleys of the roof, or if we have neighbors nearby. I absolutely love my Inspire, but that thing's a little noisy and it's a little bit intimidating if you're right next door to another residential house. So that's why I love to use the Mavic Pro, Mavic Air, even the Phantom 4. for those situations. Okay, so on the next slide, let's talk about chimney inspections. So when we started doing home inspections, that kind of led to chimney inspections. A lot of houses in my area in like the 1920s to 1950s or 60s timeframe have these old brick chimneys. And this is something that we can inspect year round because they don't really gather snow on them too much. And because they're common in older neighborhoods, they're generally a little bit older chimneys, or they're gonna look for wear and tear that they can't easily see from the ground. So they'll call in us drone pilots. And again, they are usually home inspection related. And we'll go up there and we'll capture images all around the chimney. And some things we're looking for, we're looking for the flashing to make sure that there's no damage there, no rust, no issue, nothing's peeling or bent. We look at damage to the bricks, whether we've seen some that are crumbling. This one is actually in pretty good condition here. You can see there's actually snow on the roof as well. But we look for crumbling in the masonry, and it helps them identify if they absolutely have to get an inspector up there. So sometimes these will give them the preliminary information. They'll say, yep, this one looks great, no problem. Sometimes we'll send them the pictures and be like, oh, we got to get an inspector up there. It looks like there might be further damage we want to document for that homeowner. Let's go to the next slide here, and we'll see some other pictures of chimneys. So you'll notice that we have to get all the way around to the four sides. If you look at the picture on the top left, you can see a big tree there, and that's pretty common because these are older homes. You have those really mature trees, and those trees are generally pretty close to the houses. So that means to get all four sides of the house, you're really flying in close proximity to other trees, to that building. And so you need to really have your drone skills down. It's important that you don't hit anything. And then, as Colin mentioned before, there's also birds. So this is baby season for the birds. We have a lot of nesting going on. And that means that when you are in those areas close to the trees, you also need to watch out for the birds because you are pretty close to them as well. So in order to get all four sides of that chimney, you need to be able to manage your exposure just like the regular roof inspections, because if the sun is at some angle, the other side of that chimney is going to be dark. So make sure that you understand how to manually expose your camera, either to change the shutter speed or any combination of things in order to make sure that you can actually see the detail even on the dark side, or that you don't overexpose the light side of that chimney. So we also want to get the top-down look for the chimney cap, and your job is really to document the entire chimney. So some of our lessons learned, the first thing is that exposure control to get good images all the way around. That's going to be the difference between kind of an amateur pilot who's flying on auto mode, to auto exposure, to someone who is providing really good imagery and also getting paid a little bit better for their products that they have. So it can be difficult to maintain line of sight when moving around the chimney. You have to fly on all four sides, which means 2 or maybe even 3 sides might be places where you might not easily be able to see the drone. And that's where a visual observer can help. So having someone on the other side of the building or other side of the house can help. And then we will usually have radios or something like that so we can see them. You'll notice when you do a lot of roof inspections, you are flying over your head, which makes it a little bit harder to hear if you have a visual observer on the ground. So making sure that you can actually hear each other is important. So you're flying very close to the chimneys. We know that collision avoidance, obstacle avoidance is awesome on our new drones, the Phantom 4 Pros, the Mavics. However, you don't want that to be going, the alarms to be going off constantly. So you might have to turn some of that off so that you can get close enough. I've had cases where flying underneath the trees, if I don't turn the obstacle avoidance off, it won't let me get close enough. So you do have to fly with those safety features off sometimes, which means you need to be a very good pilot in order to get in those close areas. Make sure you get the top-down views as well. Sometimes people forget those. You want to make sure you get the chimney cap and that view. That's an area where an inspector often can't access because it's too tall for them. So make sure you get all angles and all views of those chimneys. As we mentioned before, the smaller drones often work better because they can fit in the valleys of the roofs, and also to the proximity of the neighbors. And these older homes are usually closer together, and you really don't want to garner that attention of flying a large drone in the area. So we love the Mavics and the Phantom 4s for that purpose. So the commercial inspections for churches, we've actually got quite a number of churches, which is interesting. I hadn't even thought of this as an area for drones until I started getting calls for them. So churches often have older roofs. Some of them are very steep, and a lot of them will have things like slate or a tile on them that you can't walk on. So maybe they're not super high or they're not super steep, but they have these old slate tiles from the 1940s, 1950s, and the inspectors can't walk on them. So we'll usually get these for insurance claims. It's usually wind damage or excessive hail damage, things like that, and we'll get called out to do them. The steeples are usually wind or hail damage as well. And interestingly enough, in some locations, you have to have permits to climb steeples or a lot of insurance, which makes it prohibitive for an inspector to get up there for just to kind of look around to see if an insurance claim should be made. So we get a lot of calls on church steeples, and those are, they can be easy, they can be difficult. Some of them are like, I guess, see-through steeples that you can see all the way through. Some of them are like this, where it's a steeple on top of a large area that you have to fly all the way around. Sometimes, and they're usually on the ends of the building, which is kind of helpful for being able to see them. But so they're so tall that you might have to do a couple of different heights in order to capture all of the imagery. So that's kind of become an interesting part of our business, is we fly at churches a lot, which is kind of neat. So on the next slide here, this is another view of that church. This is the roof. So this was an older building. As you can see, there's a lot of moss and stuff growing on the top of it, but you can easily see things like patches. You can see the valleys. You can see anywhere in other locations there were vents in here, and we could look around the vents to make sure that there was no excessive rust going on. And as a drone pilot, it's not my job to look at this roof and say, oh, yep, this is definitely an insurance claim, or yeah, this is going to be, you know, this kind of damage. My job is to document the images and identify areas that we might need additional pictures on, and then provide that to the inspector. So like on the ridge, I can see that there's some replaced tiles up there. I can see that patch, and then there's something on the top left there that's sticking out that might be like maybe a missing tile or something. So I would then go in and, in addition to my ortho mosaic, to get some closer views of those areas. So some lessons learned from churches. The way that we do them, we generally end up with the inspector on site. And either that's a representative from the church who is putting in the insurance claim, or it's the insurance adjuster that's there that wants to see the documentation. Because of that, we always bring a visual observer. With these ones, I love to fly the Inspire. I'm not quite as, there's not as many peaks and valleys as there are in a residential house. And usually there's a little bit more space around them. So having the Inspire works out great. I can usually have my visual observer hold the second remote and then show the inspector what I'm doing, and they absolutely love it. It gives them kind of a real-time view, and they can go, oh, wait, back up. Let me see what that is. And they might be able to identify things that maybe I don't know about because I'm a drone pilot. That's my expertise. Their expertise is the adjustments and insurance claims. So they absolutely love it because they know they get the exact data that they want. Oftentimes, the inspectors also have a lot of questions about drones. So having that additional visual observer can be really helpful for someone just to talk to. You kind of create a little bit of a rapport with the inspector. And we have actually gotten calls from the inspectors who then go out to other jobs and then want us to come and help them out, which is really nice. Something to remember, when I do my home inspections, I just dress normal business casual as a drone pilot. When I do my church inspections or more commercial inspections, I make sure that I am wearing that reflective vest all the time. I love carrying a clipboard. No one looks more professional than someone with a clipboard, right? Because you're meant to be there. You've got a checklist. I have a manned aircraft pilot background, so the checklists to me are super awesome. But we always carry that clipboard with us. And on that clipboard, we have any waivers or authorizations that we need for the area. And then we also have the request from the person who hired us. We have shown up on sites before and they're like, who are you? What are you doing? Wait, who called you? Because the person working the front desk at the church is probably not the person who's involved in the insurance claim. The insurance adjuster that shows up is probably not, they're usually subcontractors to the insurance company. So they might not know that you're showing up. So I always have the name and phone number of the person who hired me for the job in case any clarification needs to happen. Okay, so let's talk about construction next. So we somehow ended up in kind of the apartment building construction area. We do a lot of apartment buildings as they're being built. I love them because they're like 24-month contracts and we're out there every month. It's regularly scheduled income, which is awesome. And because we're shooting those pictures during the construction phase, we will often get called out post-construction if there's any warranty questions. So this here is an example of a townhome. I think there's a couple, maybe 4 or 5 units in this one. And interestingly enough, this is actually just outside, I call it like the inner ring, but where you're not allowed to fly in Class D airspace, we're just outside of that. So we could only go up to 100 feet here. The awesome thing is flying inspections, you're generally only 5 to 10 feet above the building, so that wasn't an issue. But it is important to know how to get those authorizations to fly in airspace. We do a lot of work in airspace. So using drones for warranties allows for precise and detailed data, and common things that we're called for are siding concerns. There have been, unfortunately, buildings where the siding is coming off or popping off, or the slightest windstorm blows it off. Roofing is very common. You saw the house in the beginning where the shingles were peeling back. That was an entire neighborhood that had that issue. Water damage, they might be getting water damage around the windows, around the balconies, around vents, or where siding meets brick or something like that. And then windows in general, we get a lot of window construction warranty requests. So let's take a look here. On top is, we have one apartment building construction company that we do quite a bit for. And this was one of their post-construction warranty requests. It's about a 150 unit building. And unfortunately, the siding was not installed correctly on the entire building. And so what they needed was a sampling of data to bring back to the company who did the siding and show them that, hey, look, this was done incorrectly, it needs to be redone. There's actually right now a lawsuit right now, and our pictures are being used in the lawsuit for this building. And so we get on site, and we always make sure in a job this big that we are going to meet with the person who is in charge of the insurance claim, so that we get them the correct imagery. Because if we show up here for 3 hours on site and get a bunch of pictures, we want to make sure we're getting the correct pictures. So for example, he wanted pictures of where the brick met the siding on here. Underneath the window on the bottom left, there's a ledge that sticks out and they were getting water in there. In the bottom center, there was no flashing installed between the roofing and the siding underneath all the eaves across the entire apartment building. So what he wanted then was samples of each of those. So there's 150 units or so. He said, okay, get me 10 windows, get me 8 balconies, and whatever. So we created, and I'll talk about this actually in a minute, but let me show you the bottom right is the last image there. Notice that image looks blown out, like it's overexposed, but that's on purpose. When I talk about using a manual exposure to expose for the correct thing, that's what we're doing here. So what I was trying to show, and it worked out really well, was the area where the flat roof met the side of the building that came up, to expose for that. So the roof itself was blown out, but I can perfectly see where the top of that roof meets the side of the building. So let's go to the next slide here, and I'll kind of walk through what we did for the inspector. So he wanted a sampling of the windows, of the balconies, things like that. So what we did is we had a schematic, just a really rough schematic of the entire apartment building. And we would take kind of a far back shot of the area we were going to inspect so that he knew approximately where on the apartment building it was. And then on the schematic we had drawn, we would label like 1, 2, 3, 4, like W1, W2, W3 for the windows. And then when we submitted the images to him, he would be able to see that the image named W1 matched on the schematic of W1, so that if he saw damage on that window, he could then pinpoint exactly where on the building that was. It made it incredibly helpful for him, saved him a lot of time, and he was so pleased. He's like, unfortunately, if this ever happens again, I hope it doesn't, but you guys will be the first to call because your data was so easy to use and to present to the client. Very, very helpful for them. So one thing to keep in mind with these apartment buildings, the day that we shot that building or took pictures of it, it was the nicest day of like the fall. And there were tons of people outside. There was a huge park across the street. There were pedestrians everywhere. There were people sitting on the balconies, like of half of the apartment buildings. And the complex had not told anybody that there would be drone pilots on the site. So luckily I had 2 visual observers, and they basically, one of them acted as a VO, and the other one kind of acted as PR. So anytime that we flew near someone on a balcony, they would smile and wave and say, hey, we're just doing some inspections of the siding, we'll be gone in a minute. And I usually bring at least 2 drones on site just in case something happens. And one, maybe the batteries don't work, or I don't know. I always bring a backup. So I had brought the Inspire, because that's kind of the easiest, right? If I have my inspector on set so they can see what I'm looking at. And I had brought my Phantom 4 Pro. And I pull the Inspire out, and the inspector's like, yeah, so we need to get like in the balconies and then turn around and then face this part where they have drainage. And I'm like, oh my goodness, I cannot be flying my Inspire in people's balconies when they don't even know that I'm on site. So we put the Inspire back in the case, and then took the Phantom 4 out, and it's a much smaller and even a more stable drone, and that was the best drone to fly for that situation. So definitely, it's really helpful to have those smaller drones sometimes, but it's also nice to have the larger one. So it kind of depends on what your what your client base is and what your products are that you deliver, but it's nice to have those options. Okay, so on the next slide here, so I live in Minnesota, and we had the Super Bowl this year. So it was awesome. It was freezing cold, like absolutely freezing cold. It got down to like -8 in the mornings a couple of days Fahrenheit. But we had the opportunity to do a lot of flying for the Super Bowl, which was really, really neat. This is the first year that they had like a lot of drones up in the air. They were everywhere, but they actually shut down the entire city to drones 2 weeks in advance. And so it was kind of neat. We learned about all the permitting process. We were the first drone company to get permits to fly in the Minneapolis area during this shutdown process. And then we had 2 different jobs that we did. The first one was for a company that we were just doing some mapping of the area because they put up so many temporary structures. They didn't quite know, like, okay, well, where are all these structures? How does it change for emergency response, et cetera? So we did a lot of orthomosaic flying for that. And then after that, we ended up getting hired as subcontractors to another drone company where we had drones in the air for anywhere from 12 to 16 hours a day at locations around the city for 4 days straight. And my company is not that big. We use contractors occasionally. There's a couple of us that fly regularly, but I needed other drone pilots. And I would really advise you, if you are whatever industry that you're in with drones or whatever area you're in, to network with other pilots. And you'll find that you are able to refer jobs and they're able to refer jobs back to you. So we don't have a scarcity mentality. We share work whenever we can. We work with each other, we help each other. There's a lot of Facebook pages and stuff out there we're all part of. And so this company called and they're like, can you staff it? And we were able to immediately say, yes, we can staff this project. It was a lot of money, it was awesome. And we were able to easily staff it because we knew other good drone pilots in the area and we were friendly with them. So we had, besides the people in our company, we had hired 5 other drone pilots. We flew from anywhere from 8 a.m. until midnight, 4 days in a row. And it was an amazing experience to work as a team with that many people. So we were actually live streaming the entire day. All 4 days, and we had to have, as one drone landed, the other drone had to get up in the air to finish the live stream. So we were continuously live streaming for 12 to 16 hours a day, every single day. One of the important things that we learned in this process was how to say no to a client. So unfortunately, it was snowing for at least one of the days, and they're like, come on, you guys got to get up. And we're like, you know what, it's below 3 miles visibility, we cannot fly. It's a 107 requirement. And we actually got a call from the FAA like an hour later, like, hey, are you guys in the air? We see a drone. And we're like, nope, that's not us. And the FAA went and found that person because it was maybe a half mile of visibility and they were flying a drone in the area. So definitely learn and make sure your clients know the expectations of when you can and can't fly. Our no fly for temperature was -6. So it was a little bit chilly. But it was -8 one morning, so they had to wait until like 10 o'clock in the morning for us to fly that morning. So it was an awesome experience. I loved working with a big team like that. We're really kind of breaking the ground, all of us drone pilots, me, Colin, all of you, because this is all new technology. So every year, every month, every week, every day, something new is happening with drones, and it's because we're flying safe, we're flying responsibly, and we're working together as a team, even if it's nationwide people. So very neat experience. Okay, one more thing I want to talk about, and that is our aerial roof inspections workshop. So we teach these workshops around the country, and they go through a lot of the knowledge that you'll need to know for things that Colin and I just talked about. So for example, on day one, we do a lot of roofing 101, how to do aerial roof inspections. We basically teach you the lingo to use, the things to look for, so that when an inspector calls you and they say, hey, go inspect the dormer, you don't go, what's a dormer? So we teach you all that information so that you can go talk intelligently to your client. We also teach you how to capture quality imagery, how to get off of auto exposure and onto manual, so that you can get those best exposed images. And then we even do things like mapping and modeling. So how to do orthomosaics for the best resolution for pictures. So we'll do an orthomosaic and you can actually pick out like nail heads and the roofing materials, or you can identify whether something is bird poop, if it's a white speck, whether it's bird poop or moss or mildew or a paper bag that's stuck up there. So the imagery is amazing. And then we even do some thermal imaging as well. So these workshops are taught all around the country, and then the information that you learn from those, you can actually bring it to any type of inspection, whether it's utilities or roofing or the commercial warranty work that we do. So I'd highly encourage you to take a look on the Dart Drones website and see if there is a location near you.
Thank you so much, Christina. And before we get into our Q&A session, I did want to quickly mention our 2018 workshop schedule. So this year we will be in Denver, Chicago, Houston, New York Metro, Las Vegas, Ashburn, Atlanta, and Dallas. And we will only be in each of these cities once this year, so definitely take advantage of these dates. I will also be sending out an email with some information later on today, so I'll be sure to include all of these dates for you guys. All right, so we did get a few questions. So we'll start going through a few of those. Colin, when you were going through your section, someone asked, which type of drone do you use for these types of inspections?
Well, it depends on which ones we were talking about. When it's something that involves generating orthomosaics, so using photogrammetry software, typically we use the Phantom 4 Pro, simply because it's got the best camera sensor, basically, with the 20 megapixel 1-inch sensor, mechanical shutter, all things that that photogrammetry software really likes whenever it's building the products. So that's fairly common with us. Whenever we're doing some of the more when we were doing the power line work, that was actually with a M600, DJI M600 with a RTK solution from DJI, basically just to provide the security from the magnetometer interference, no additional positioning accuracy from a mapping or modeling accuracy standpoint. And then beyond that, like Christina, we also have an Inspire, and we have done some long range projects, larger mapping projects with fixed wing aircraft as well, but we don't usually do that for the roadway projects because we can't stop the movement of the fixed wing whenever we cross the roadways. So until we get some regulatory changes on that, right now we'll probably stick with the multi-rotor so that we can still do that.
Great, thank you. And then Christina, as you were going through some of your inspection scenarios, we got quite a few questions just on pricing in general. So someone asked, what's the average cost of a home inspection? And then another person asked about payment terms and then like contracts for repetitive inspections. So if you could kind of just maybe cover pricing in general, if you don't mind.
Sure, yes. So pricing for the home inspections really varies based on your market. So generally, in the Midwest market where I'm at, the average home price is $200,000 to $300,000, with the larger homes being more in the $500,000 to $800,000 range. And a home inspection usually costs between maybe $400 and $600 or $700. So there isn't a lot of margin to add in a drone pilot there. So those are, while they might be a higher frequency for me, they're a lower paying job, because sometimes those home inspectors are paying basically out of their pocket or out of their own margins in order to cover that flight. So those can really vary, but they may be in like the $75 to $150 range. And again, it'll vary based on your market. The commercial inspections are a little bit different. I found that like kind of the construction industry is an amazing industry to be in. There's a little bit more money available there. Unfortunately, construction projects are always over budget, which is, I think, common in almost any industry. But those ones, they usually have budget available. The important thing is to get in before the construction starts, so that program manager does bid your cost in, so they're not taking it out of kind of their own budget themselves. So they actually budget for you. So we found that we have a higher paying construction hourly rate if we can get in before the project begins. If it's after the project begins, it's going to be maybe half what we would normally get paid. So and the rates are really going to vary based on your area. So I would say, hourly rates between $100 and $250, and that depends on, what kind of equipment you're flying, whether you need visual observers or not, and then the products that you're developing or sending to the client. And then the other question wasn't there another question in there?
They asked about payment terms and then contracts for repetitive.
Oh, contracts and payment terms. Yes, so we take credit card for pretty much everything. It's just the way of the industry, and then we pay whatever the processing fee is. So have an online processor and have something that looks a little bit professional. So we always take credit card, and then our payment terms they pay us after the job, and it's usually a net 7 or a 7-day payment term. We don't ask for payment before, because there are cases, especially for the home inspections, where the drone flight may not happen. So if someone calls for home inspection, they only have maybe 24 hours to get it done. If we can't get out there because of rain, snow, etc., I don't want to pay the credit card fees and send it back and make negative money. So we've never had a problem with payment from these companies. We have good relationships with them. We've always been paid for them. We do have contracts with our longer term construction companies, those 24 months to 36 months apartment buildings that are going up. And you can work with, a local attorney. There are a lot of small business offices that will actually help you write contracts. So I'd recommend going down that avenue.
Awesome, thank you. And then Colin, maybe you could cover this one. Someone said, other than Part 107, is there any other education, experience, or background that is required to do inspections like this?
Yeah, well, definitely, as Christina mentioned, the biggest benefit of our workshop, and the something that you need to make sure that you understand before you put yourself out there is knowledge about the industry that you're looking to serve. If you don't understand the types of things that the client is asking you to get imagery of, if you don't understand what those things are, where to look for them, what some of the issues may be that could affect them, from an inspection standpoint, that we would want to document from a damage perspective, things like that, then you're not going to be able to, be your most effective. And, ultimately, that's probably going to become pretty apparent to the client relatively quickly, and it's going to hurt your overall credibility. So definitely make sure that you learn about the various industries that you're looking to serve. And also, get some time out there flying the aircraft. Yes, these aircraft are designed to be tools. They're designed to be, very easy to operate. However, all of us that have experience and have gone through the process and seen the chaos that the world can throw us, we can tell you that you are going to have an increased skill level the more you fly, and that increased skill level is definitely going to translate into better results. If you go out there with just a Part 107 certificate and barely a handful of flights under your belt, again, the results that you're able to produce and what the client's going to think about that, chances are it's going to reflect poorly on you. So, take the time to make sure you fully understand your system, how to operate it, as well as understand the industries that you're looking to serve.
Great, thank you. And we have a couple more minutes left, so we'll cover one more question. And Colin, this one was actually for you as well. You mentioned, how you plan for your different flights. So someone asked, what is your preferred mission planning tool?
Yeah, so from a mission planning standpoint, I wouldn't say that I use a standard like software package or anything like that. My mission planning, from the standpoint of a pre-flight assessment, really starts while I'm at home, and it starts by going on the computer and looking at satellite imagery of the areas that we've been assigned to fly, trying to figure out where the hazards are, what are where the different factors that are going to come into play at that flight, and I'll actually start planning out what our flight profile might look like by looking at that imagery. We'll look at places where we have alternate landing sites that would be available in case of emergencies, different things like that. Then usually a few days before we start looking at the weather forecasts, and that's really where we get into our go no go decision making. Once we've obviously confirmed airspace and confirmed that the job's doable. So weather information, that goes into our planning process, and that continues right up to when we actually arrive on site. When we arrive on site, we have to do a final assessment. So we have to see, again, where people are on that day. Look around for those areas where, again, we may have issues with birds, things like that, different sources of interference, and that goes into it. Now, if you're talking about flight profile planning from the standpoint of like autonomous software, I like using DJI's Ground Station Pro. I like using Drone Deploy's command and control software. I think as a third-party developer, their command and control software works very well and gives you more options than just your straight basically terrain modeling with nadir images. It also allows for better coordination with some of the obliques and structural modeling as well, at least part of that phase. Although, as I tell everyone, and we mentioned it before, for a lot of projects that you do with OrthoMosaics, the autonomous software will give you a baseline, but you are going to need to also be grabbing additional data, additional photos, while either manually flying or using some other semi-autonomous modes, because to fully cover those areas and flying at low altitudes where hazards are more prevalent, things like that, that definitely becomes an issue. So that's kind of an overview of sort of our leading up to the flight process in a nutshell.
Awesome, thanks. All right, so that's all the time we have for today. And as you can tell from Christina and Colin's scenarios, our flight instructors really have so much experience in a lot of different industries, and we'd love to share that knowledge. If anyone has any other questions, feel free to email us or call us. But besides that, thank you so much, Christina and Colin, and thanks everyone for joining us today. Like I mentioned earlier, I will be sending out an email with a recording of today's webinar, as well as a copy of the slide deck. And thank you again, and we hope to see you guys at an inspections workshop in the future.
Thanks, everyone.